and welcome to Life Talk. I'm Pastor Angie Lynch, and today we are continuing a conversation on loneliness. Last week, we did an episode on You Are Not Alone, and we will be continuing with that because you're not alone, even if you do feel lonely. But during this week, I began to talk to people about loneliness, and just so many people in today's climate are feeling this epidemic of loneliness. So we wanted to do a little bit more on loneliness and talk about it a little bit. Now, when you're lonely, I want you to know that God cares. God absolutely cares. One of the best things I think about being on the Grace Awakening Network is it's all about every speaker. You can flip through the different programs that they have here, and I encourage you to do it because every single person that you listen to on this channel is going to be talking about God's love for you. Just the overwhelming, passionate, just completely just overflowing love for you. His grace, His mercy, His goodness, His love. So I encourage you to listen to the programs on this channel. While we're talking about loneliness today, you can be assured that God intimately cares about what's going on with you. He's not just somebody that's distant. He's not somebody that's far away from you and is not in touch with your life and doesn't care about your life. He intimately cares about your life. Now, last week we talked about loneliness. This week, I just couldn't get it off my mind and I couldn't get it off my heart. And as I began to talk with different people about it, I just kept being reminded at people's different circumstances. Just because we feel alone doesn't mean that we are alone. God definitely cares. In Psalm 34:18, it tells us, "The Lord is close to the brokenhearted, and He saves those that are crushed in spirit." He's not somebody that is just sitting on the sidelines on your life. I promise you, He is very active in your life, and He definitely, absolutely, 100% cares about everything going on in your life. So when we were talking last week, about the epidemic, it is just, especially since we had COVID, right? People were struggling with loneliness before, but it does seem to have a larger impact on our lives, post-COVID, because post-COVID, everybody got used to being isolated. Everybody got used to being alone. And that is an additional layer that comes into the loneliness that we're experiencing. So let's get into this and let's talk a little bit. I want to talk to you about the difference between acute and chronic, because as we go into some of the different forms of loneliness that we can experience, I want you to also understand if you're somebody that doesn't typically have loneliness as an issue in your life, when you have an acute case of loneliness. Acute is something that's sudden, something that comes on. Say if you unexpectedly experience a loss, experience a death in your family, in your life, around you. That's something that comes on suddenly. But a lot of people experience chronic loneliness. And what I mean by chronic loneliness, it's this pervasive feeling. It's the predominant emotion that they feel. There's nothing wrong with feeling lonely. God gave us a wide range of emotions, just like a wide range of pictures to paint, a beautiful picture, a beautiful landscape of color and vibrance. He gave us plenty of emotions to paint the emotions in our life. And there's nothing wrong with feeling lonely. But what happens is when it becomes your predominant emotion, no, that's not what His desire for you is at all. It's not what his desire is for you at all. And so in that, what are you feeling? What is your predominant emotion? If every day when you get out of bed, you experience this loneliness and you're constantly thinking about, gosh, I just feel so lonely. I just feel so disconnected, then probably you're in a chronic state of loneliness. Now, how do we get out of the chronic state? How do we get out of the acute state? I think it's very important for us to begin to understand what type of loneliness that we're experiencing, because although the answer is always the same, it's God. How are we going to get healed? Jesus is the healer. In the presence of Jesus, everything is healed. So if we can recognize that we're experiencing some type of loneliness, whether it's acute loneliness or whether it's chronic loneliness, then we can be able to understand that, wow, I need to get these hurts and these wounds in the presence of Jesus. Again, if it's just a feeling that's going to come and go, that's fine. You can process through it. It'll just come and it'll go. But if you find yourself stuck in the emotion of loneliness, then that's really where we have to dig into community, and we have to dig into allowing the Trinity to begin to heal us from these loneliness wounds. It doesn't feel good when you're stuck in the state of loneliness, where what happens? You just wake up and it's just like a dark cloud that's overcast over you. And you're wondering, it really does color how you see everything during the day, how you approach your problems, how you approach your relationships. You begin to feel very distant. It's almost like, when somebody's experiencing loneliness, their volume dial begins to get turned down, and everything seems distant away. Everything seems unobtainable because I'm just alone in everything that I feel, in everything that I think. And my thinking begins to get distorted. I began to think nobody can experience what I'm experiencing. People can't relate to me. I feel so alone that I don't believe people understand what I'm going through. And I quit trying to explain it to them. I quit trying to talk to them about it. So therefore, I'm already isolated and feel incredibly lonely. I want people to be involved in my life, but at the same time, I don't see a path where people are going to care or people are going to come into my life. I don't see a path where I'm going to meet somebody that cares. The people that I think previously cared, I don't feel connected. Therefore, I don't feel like they care any longer. And this really begins that the descent into loneliness. When we get stuck in it, we can't see out of it. Again, some of us, it's normal in some circumstances to experience loneliness. If your best friend has moved away, you're going to feel a little lonely. If, there's certain circumstances, like when your kids go to a new season in life, it's normal to feel a little lonely for that old season. Now, again, that's not the same as if you get stuck in that state. Very different experience if you get stuck in empty nest syndrome, right? Very different if your best friend moves away and you can't seem to snap out of it. You can't seem to get out of it. So I want you to understand, nothing wrong with loneliness. We have a vast array of emotions, and we're supposed to have a vast array of emotions. But the biggest difference is, I don't want to get stuck in loneliness. I don't want you to get stuck in loneliness. Once we get stuck, we really have to, hopefully we have great people around us that alert us to it. Hopefully the feelings that we're experiencing begin to alert us to it also. So let's talk about, since we've talked about the acute and the chronic, remember the acute is something suddenly happens. There's an event or something that brings it on impactfully, very suddenly. Now the chronic, again, is just, gosh, I've been feeling this way for so long. I don't remember when I didn't feel this way. It's very, very long term. It's just like a pervasive feeling around me, and I've been experiencing it for a long time. So to the types of loneliness. And this is not an exhaustive list. I just wrote down a few of them so that we can help recognize. Sometimes we don't recognize when we're feeling lonely. We don't recognize when we feel so disconnected. We just begin to feel like, wow, I feel distance, and I feel a hunger for something. I feel a hunger for companionship, but I don't feel like it's accessible to me. So we want to be able to recognize some different types of loneliness. One of the loneliness from circumstances. And what that kind of means is sometimes we just get bogged down in circumstance, whether it's just like a chronic thing where we're like, wow, my life hasn't gone how I thought it was going to go. And so we become very lonely we begin to experience regret. We begin to experience the idea of, wow, if my life had gone in a different direction, then I wouldn't feel this way. I would feel vibrant. I would feel full of life. But since I haven't been able to accomplish what I want to accomplish, or I haven't been able to do the things that I've wanted to do, we begin to let our circumstances dictate our emotion. And the predominant emotion that a lot of times in those situations that comes up is loneliness. Now we can experience it also, with circumstances. That's kind of like an overall when we feel like our life just isn't going our way. But we can experience loneliness when we have a job change, when we have a job loss, when you move, things like that, when your circumstances change, when your environment changes, it does begin to bring on sometimes a feeling of loneliness. If you begin to recognize it, then you can begin to deal with it. Now remember, it's okay to feel lonely. But can I snap back from it? Am I setting up camp and beginning to just get immersed in this loneliness? And remember, a lot of times when we feel lonely, again, I keep saying this, but we don't see a way out. That's kind of how you know if you're stuck. If it's the biggest feeling that you experience, and you don't feel like you can move beyond it, that's a very, very important part of it. Now, loneliness from lack of family or family support. A lot of times during holidays here at the ministry, we'll often think and pray for the people that don't have family. We don't, if we have a huge amount of family and we have a huge amount of family support, we don't really tend to think of this. We don't tend to think of people whose family have passed away, people who are separated from their family. And I'm talking about your earthly family or your earthly relatives. That's why I would say it's so important for us to build our spiritual family, because that gives us another way to connect, because we're a body of Christ. But if you're feeling like your relational family here on earth is broken down, that's a huge, huge source of loneliness for a lot of people. We don't think about it, but on Father's Day and Mother's Day, if our fathers and mothers have passed away, if we're distant from our children, or I know I was talking to somebody last Christmas, and what they did for their giving project was they had a Christmas tree, and a lot of times they had done a Christmas tree for kids, young kids, and they didn't, their parents were having financial troubles. So what they did was they were like, okay, here's your tree angel. Well, what they did is they began to understand in the school district that a lot of high schoolers were without homes. It's heartbreaking to think about that. We hear about it sometimes on the news, but I think that it's very underreported how many older teenagers actually do not live in the protection of parents anymore, whether they got kicked out or whether they ran away. And most times these kids, they quit attending school. But there were, in this district, they had a lot of kids that were trying to go to school and trying to make it work. So they did a specific, all the angels on the tree that year were for these high school students who were without parents. They were couch surfing, they were sleeping in cars, they were sleeping in parks. And the school district had done a really great job at trying to understand what their living situation and their home situation was. So some of the teachers began to report it, and they were able to bless some of these children because they really are. They're just kids, and they needed food, they needed clothing, they needed resources because like even if we say an adult is 18, there's still so many things that they need to be protected about. So when you think about like families and family support, it can look so different. There can be a child that no longer has parents. It could be a parent that no longer has contact with kids. It could be siblings are at odds. It could be kids are at odds with parents. Adult parents are at odds with their adult children. And so just taking a look, not everybody has a solid family. Most people, unfortunately, do not have a solid family. So even at, say Christmas, you hear all the time about siblings now, they live so far apart. They're not connecting. They're not staying connected. And they see each other maybe once a year, every couple years. And we're just living so distant. So we can, as far as family, feel extremely lonely for a family unit. And even if you have your family unit there, many times now, people don't feel like they have the support of their family. Even just, I would say some of the people that we deal with in their faith, maybe they've chosen a different path for their faith, so they feel very alone and very judged and very not supported in their choices that they've made for faith. Sometimes there's a lot of religion involved. And if there's religion, that's kind of like they don't appreciate the message of grace and don't live the message of grace. So there can be some internal conflict in these relationships with each other because they don't always have family support. You don't always have your family. So that's one loneliness, is when we miss having a family. And like I said, that's another reason why our spiritual family is so important. We can have loneliness from the wounds that we carry. We have hurts, say somebody has and it can be simple wounds or it can be complex wounds. And what I mean by complex wounds is the wounds just stack up. If you have relationships that have suffered or that have felt betraying in your life, and you have a wound and you have another wound and another wound and they just tend to stack up on each other. So what do we do when we have a lot of wounds? We tend to withdraw, and the withdraw, even though the thing that we want most is to be connected to people and to talk to people and to be loved by people, it doesn't happen. Why? Because our walls are built up. We're very distant. We kind of, without realizing it, in our emotional and spiritual blueprint, we push people away instead of inviting them into our lives, even though that's what we want. It hurts. And so when we have our wounds, we can have a lot of loneliness from that. Loneliness from lack of friendships. We're meant to have many different types of relationships. And if I feel like I don't have enough social interaction with people, if I don't feel like I have enough meaningful relationships in our life, when we talked last episode and we were talking about the epidemic of loneliness and just talking about how most people today don't feel like they have people that they can go to and talk to about major problems, about major issues, about things that they need to talk about. More so than ever in our society today, everybody just seems to be going in different directions, and we don't connect the way that we used to, and we are starving for connection. So much so that we see people suffering from these lack of relationships. If you have a church community, if you have a spiritual community, that is awesome. But many people now are being disenfranchised from churches. If a church is very, very religious instead of relational, a lot of people are bouncing out of those types of communities and those types of environments. And it's like, where do you go to find somebody that believes like you and thinks like you? And people are starving for friendships. And when you're in school, when you're growing up and you're in school, you kind of have a built-in set of friends, whether you like all of them or not. You have a closer proximity to making friends. Once you get out of school, even in work, a lot of times people do not become friends at work. What do they become? They become coworkers, and they're like, "Ooh, I don't want to mix business and my personal life." So a lot of people really suffer. I'd say loneliness from lack of relationship, from a romantic relationship. Many, many, many single people nowadays looking for partners, looking for good, solid people of character, are having a harder and harder time of finding each other. So many different people wanting so many different things. And then, like I said, you stack in the wounds, you stack in the loneliness, you stack in all those other things. It makes it difficult for people to find romantic partners, just marriage partners. What are they looking for? What are you looking for? What are they looking for? It's just, there's a lot of single people out there today, good people trying to find other good people. I would say lack of purpose. Loneliness from lack of purpose or direction. We talked a little bit about that last week. We are meant to have direction. Where there's no vision, people perish. Like our soul becomes just sad and dying. Because why? Because we are purpose-driven people. We really are. We are for the kingdom, living in a world, and that can make it different. Also, I'll say I wanted to expand on this one a little bit. Loneliness from the loss of a loved one. And remember, we talked about acute and we talked about chronic. A lot of times when you lose a loved one, it is very, very sudden. But sometimes you can lose a loved one that they were in an illness for a long time. So that's more chronic. There's a lot of loneliness that comes from a loss. I've known people that lost children. I've known people that have lost parents, sisters, brothers, friends. And when they come in, and whether it's a sudden thing or whether it is, they expected it, whether it was an illness that was protracted, then it hurts. And they are lonely for that person, even though we know the person, we know where they're going, we know what happened. It still hurts and it's still lonely. And I won't get too much into the grieving cycle. Maybe we can do that in a later episode. But loneliness, it is part of grieving, and it's part of how you experience things. I'll say I wanted to share one of the I'd say the time that I felt the loneliness, and the most lonely in my life, was a time where it was right after the birth of my first child. And after the birth of my first child, I got pregnant like 4 months after that. And I was 24 weeks pregnant, and we lost the baby. He was stillborn. And I remember the process of going to the hospital and having to give birth, and knowing already that our child had passed. And it was devastating. I remember it was just such a awkward, I think, position for the people at the hospital. It was very awkward for us. And they put us in, after I'd given birth, and they'd put us in a wing and a room that was very, very, very isolated, because they didn't want me to be around the nursery. They didn't want me to be around the interactions with the other, kindly, because that would have, in itself been a different way of suffering and a different pain. So I remember just being completely devastated, not understanding, it was just so sad. I remember out of exhaustion, I had finally fallen asleep, and then I woke up in the middle of the night, and there was nobody there. It was in a room that had a couple different beds. They had, like I said, they had put me in a different place, and it was just it was the quietest place, and it was the most loneliest place. And to wake up, and at first, I woke up in confusion and like, where am I? And then the flood of everything that happened. And I remember in that moment just how alone I felt and just how lonely that I felt. And it is a heartbreaking, wrecking emotion to feel that lonely in a moment. People experience that chronically too. People experience what I experienced that night, and they experience over years, sometimes months. And I think as a Christian community, luckily I had a support system and was able to move through that and not to get stuck in that. But it took a time. It took a lot of time to get through that, to properly process those emotions. But people are in pain every day. People experience loneliness. People feel very distant. And people wake up feeling like, I don't know if I'm going to have a meaningful conversation, meaningful contact with anybody during this day. So last week when we talked about, some solutions to loneliness. And in Genesis it claims that it's not good for man to be alone, and understanding that God is always there sometimes is difficult for us as people. And I believe one of the best witnesses that we can do in our life is, if God has poured into you, if God has, like the experience that I had with loneliness. I know what it feels like to be lonely. And I think everybody out there to some degree understands what it's like to be lonely. I would just ask you and challenge you to, reach out to the people around you. Reach out to people who don't have family. Become spiritual family with people and pour into them. John 14:18 says, I will not leave you as orphans. I will come to you. And I really believe that as people who have been filled, if you've been filled, reach out to those people. If you are hurting, reach out and let somebody know that you're hurting. You're not meant to be alone. You're meant to be in the presence of God 24/7. And you are, because He is always there with you, pouring out and loving you. Until next week, I want you thinking about, are you lonely? Ask for help. If you're filled in the moment, reach out and let it overflow. God bless.